What if I told you that one of history's most diabolical torture devices was designed not to kill quickly, but to create something far worse? A state of psychological limbo where victims would beg for death but couldn't reach it. The device I'm talking about looks deceptively simple. A wooden pyramid, 4 legs. But this innocent-looking contraption was engineered to exploit a psychological phenomenon that modern neuroscience has only recently understood: the torture of infinite time. Today we're dissecting the Judas cradle, also known as the Judas chair. But we're not just exploring what it did to the body. We're uncovering how it weaponized time itself, and why its psychological effects were so devastating that it reveals fundamental truths about human consciousness that psychologists are still studying today. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Robert Cialdini calls escalating commitment one of the most dangerous psychological traps, and how medieval inquisitors accidentally discovered principles of mental breakdown that would make modern psychologists rewrite their textbooks. But first, let me tell you about the woman who endured the Judas cradle for 47 hours straight, and what happened to her mind. Her name was Isabella Montes, and in 1568 she made the mistake of being accused of witchcraft in the Spanish Netherlands. What happened to her over the next 47 hours would reveal the most insidious aspect of the Judas cradle. It wasn't designed to break your body quickly, it was designed to break your mind slowly. The Judas cradle was deceptively simple in its construction, but psychologically complex in its application. Unlike the rack, which created intense pain quickly, the cradle created moderate, constant discomfort that could last for days. And here's the crucial part. This wasn't a design flaw, it was the entire point. You see, the inquisitors who used the Judas cradle understood something that modern psychology calls duration neglect. Our brains are terrible at processing extended periods of discomfort. We can handle intense pain for short periods, but moderate pain for extended periods, that breaks something deeper. Isabella's case records, preserved in the archives of the Spanish Inquisition, show something remarkable. For the first 6 hours, she maintained her innocence. By hour 12, she was bargaining. By hour 24, she was confessing to crimes she couldn't have committed. But by hour 47, she was confessing to crimes that didn't even exist. This reveals the first dark principle of the Judas cradle. It didn't torture the body to break the will, it tortured time itself to break reality. And the way it did this exposes a terrifying vulnerability in human consciousness that most people never realize they have. Modern neuroscience has identified something called temporal processing disorders, Mayans conditions, where the brain loses track of time. But the creators of the Judas cradle were inducing this artificially, 400 years before we had the science to understand what they were doing. Here's how it worked. The cradle created what psychologists now call microstressors, Mayan small, constant irritations that accumulate over time. Unlike acute stress, which activates our fight or flight response, chronic microstress does something more insidious. It depletes our cognitive resources without triggering our natural coping mechanisms. Robert Greene discusses this in Law 19. Know who you're dealing with. Mightiest, do not offend the wrong person. But the cradle operated on a more subtle principle. Don't break someone quickly, because then they might find strength in martyrdom. Break them so slowly they don't realize it's happening until it's too late. This aligns perfectly with Robert Cialdini's principle of commitment and consistency. The cradle didn't force immediate compliance. It created conditions where victims would gradually commit to smaller and smaller compromises until they lost track of who they originally were. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The psychological records from the Spanish Inquisition show that victims of the Judas cradle didn't just confess, they began to believe their confessions were true. They experienced what we now call false memory syndromes. Their minds literally rewrote their past to make sense of their present suffering. And this reveals something about human consciousness that's so unsettling, most people refuse to believe it's true. But understanding this might be the only way to recognize when it's happening to you. What the Judas cradle exploited wasn't physical weakness. It was a fundamental bug in human consciousness. Our sense of self isn't as solid as we think. It's actually a constantly reconstructed narrative. And when that reconstruction process is disrupted, the results are terrifying. Neuroscientist Dr. Antonio Damasio's research on consciousness reveals that our sense of self is actually a story our brain tells us every moment. The Judas cradle attacked this storytelling process by creating what we now call narrative disruptions. It made it impossible for victims to maintain a coherent sense of who they were. Think about it. When you're in constant moderate discomfort for extended periods, you can't focus on anything else. You can't maintain your normal thought patterns. You can't access your memories clearly. Essentially, the cradle performed a slow-motion lobotomy without touching the brain. Isabella Monte's confession transcript shows this progression clearly. Early statements reference her family, her faith, her identity. But as hours pass, these references disappear. By the end, she's speaking as if she's a completely different person, because psychologically she was. This is why sleep deprivation is used in modern interrogation. This is why cult indoctrination involves extended periods of physical discomfort combined with information overload. This is why certain high-pressure sales tactics involve keeping customers in uncomfortable situations for extended periods. The Judas cradle wasn't just torturing individuals, it was conducting early experiments in consciousness manipulation, and the principles it revealed are still being used today, just in more subtle forms. But there's something even more disturbing about how the cradle worked. It didn't just break down identity, it replaced it with something else. And understanding this replacement process reveals a dark truth about human suggestibility that most people never want to face. Modern psychology recognizes something called cognitive load theories, the idea that our brains have limited processing capacity. When that capacity is overwhelmed, we become extremely susceptible to suggestion. The Judas cradle was essentially a cognitive load machine, designed to overwhelm the mind's defenses. Dr. Daniel Kahneman's research on decision-making shows that when we're cognitively depleted, we default to what he calls System 1 thinking, automatic, emotional responses, rather than rational analysis. The cradle induced permanent System 1 states, making victims incapable of critical thinking. But here's the truly insidious part. The inquisitors using the cradle weren't just extracting confessions, they were implanting new belief systems. Victims didn't just admit to witchcraft, they became convinced they were witches. They didn't just confess to heresy, they converted to believing they were heretics. This exemplifies Robert Greene's Law 27, play on people's need to believe to create a cult-like following. But the cradle took this further. It didn't just exploit existing beliefs, it created new ones by breaking down the psychological barriers that normally protect our core identity. We see this today in what psychologists call coercive persuasions, techniques that combine physical discomfort, time pressure, and information control to reshape someone's belief system. Corporate training seminars that involve sleep deprivation and physical discomfort. Political re-education programs, even some extreme therapeutic interventions. The scariest part, most people who experience these modern versions don't realize it's happening. They feel like they're making free choices, just like Isabella Montes eventually felt like her confessions were voluntary revelations rather than coerced admissions. But understanding how the Judas cradle worked gives us something powerful. The ability to recognize these patterns before they completely take hold. And that recognition might be the only defense we have. Every principle the Judas cradle exploited can be found in Robert Cialdini's Weapons of Influence, but amplified through time and repetition. Commitment becomes escalating commitment. Authority becomes absolute authority. Social proof becomes social isolation until the only proof comes from your captors. Consider modern workplace crunch cultures, mitis extended periods of moderate stress, sleep deprivation, and social isolation, all in service of voluntary commitment to company goals. Or social media addiction platforms designed to create moderate constant stimulation that gradually reshapes your attention span and decision-making processes. The cradle's time distortion effects show up in high-pressure sales situations that deliberately extend beyond normal comfort zones. Limited time offers that somehow always get extended. Timeshare presentations that last 6-8 hours. Multi-level marketing recruitment sessions that combine physical discomfort with psychological pressure. Even some therapeutic and self-help contexts can accidentally replicate cradle dynamics. Extended intensive workshops that combine sleep deprivation, emotional vulnerability and authority figures, offering breakthrough insights. The techniques aren't necessarily malicious, but the psychological effects can be similar. The key difference between Isabella Montes and us is awareness. She had no framework for understanding what was happening to her mind. We do. When someone wants to keep you in an uncomfortable situation for extended periods, while presenting themselves as your only source of relief, that's a red flag. The Judas cradle teaches us that the most dangerous forms of manipulation don't announce themselves. They feel like natural progression, voluntary choices, gradual revelations, but they're not. The Judas cradle was retired not because it was too cruel, but because it was too effective. It didn't just extract confessions, it created true believers in their own guilt. Understanding this distinction is crucial for protecting yourself from modern psychological manipulation. Robert Greene's 48 Laws warn us about the games people play for power, but the cradle principle adds another layer. Beware of anyone who wants to control your time, your comfort, and your access to alternative perspectives simultaneously. That's not negotiation, that's consciousness restructuring. Here's what I want you to do. In the comments below, tell me about a time when someone tried to keep you in an uncomfortable situation while positioning themselves as your only source of relief. Maybe it was a sales situation, maybe a relationship, maybe a work environment. What were the warning signs you recognized, or wish you had recognized? And if you've ever experienced that moment where you realized your own thoughts weren't entirely your own anymore, that gradual shift from who you were to who someone else wanted you to be, share that story too. Understanding these patterns collectively makes us all more resistant to them individually. Hit that subscribe button because next week we're exploring something even more disturbing, the Iron Maiden, and why the psychological terror of anticipated dooms is more powerful than actual doom. We'll dive into why humans are more afraid of uncertain bad outcomes than certain ones, and how this fear response is being weaponized in modern contexts you encounter every day. You think you're immune to fear-based manipulation? Wait until you understand how the mere possibility of consequences can control behavior more effectively than actual consequences ever could. This one's going to change how you see every threat you encounter. Until then, remember, your time is your consciousness is your identity, and your identity is your freedom. Guard all three jealously, because once you understand what we're exploring in these videos, you'll realize how many people are trying to take them from you, one small compromise at a time.